The morning mist was still sitting low over the valley when Dusty Hargrove pulled his truck up to the old Callaway farm on the edge of Ridgeline, Montana. He was 54 years old that summer, and he had spent most of those years convincing himself that some things were just not meant for him. A wife was one of those things. He stepped out of the truck and adjusted the collar of his worn leather jacket, looked out at the dry golden fields stretching toward the hills. He had driven out here a dozen times over the past 3 months on account of the fence repairs the Callaway estate needed done. After old Earl Callaway passed away in the spring. But if Dusty was honest with himself, which he rarely allowed himself to be, he had driven out here a dozen times because of Clara. Clara May was 48 years old, and she had the kind of quiet beauty that sneaks up on a person the way a good song does. You don't notice it at first, and then one day it just stops you cold. She was Earl's niece, and she had come out from Billings after he passed to settle the estate, sell off what needed selling, and figure out what came next for herself. She wore her blonde hair loose most days, and she had a way of holding her chin up, even when things were hard that Dusty found himself thinking about at odd hours of the night. She kept chickens. That was the first thing she had told him when they met back in April. She had been standing right there in the yard, with a red hen tucked under her arm like it was the most natural thing in the world, and she had said, "I kept chickens back home too, so at least something out here feels familiar." And Dusty had nodded and looked at his boots and said that was real good. He was not a man of many words. Over those 3 months, something quiet had grown between them. The way things grow in dry country, slow and stubborn and deeper than you expect. Clara would bring him coffee in a blue tin mug when he was working the fence line. They would sit on the old log bench by the barn and talk about small things. The weather, the deer that had been coming down from the hills. The way the sunsets out here looked like someone had set the whole sky on fire. Sometimes they talked about bigger things. She told him about her marriage that had ended 12 years ago. She said it without bitterness, just the way a person describes weather that has already passed. She said she had loved her husband, but they had wanted different lives, and by the time they figured that out, they had already spent the best years trying to make it fit. Dusty told her about his own story. A woman named Patrice he had almost married back when he was 32. She had left for Portland, and he had stayed in Montana, and that had been that. He said it like it was a simple thing. Clara looked at him with those blue eyes, and he had a feeling she understood it was not simple at all. It was a Tuesday in late July when it happened. Dusty had finished replacing the last section of fence along the north pasture, and he was washing his hands at the outdoor spigot when Clara came walking across the yard with her red hen under her arm again. She had a way of carrying that chicken like it was a purse, and it always made Dusty want to smile, though he held it back out of habit. She said the estate lawyer had called that morning. She said the paperwork was almost done, and that the farm would likely be listed for sale by September. Dusty dried his hands on the back of his jeans, and he looked out at the hills, and he said that sounded about right. There was a long quiet between them then, the kind of quiet that holds a lot of things that haven't been said yet. Clara set the chicken down. The bird wandered off toward the barn, and she said she had been thinking about what came next. For herself, she said she wasn't sure she wanted to go back to Billings. She said Ridgeline had gotten under her skin somehow. Dusty looked at her then. He said that happened to people out here. The land had a way of doing that. She smiled at that, a small, careful smile. And then, without entirely meaning to, Dusty said it. He said, "You know, Clara, you've been out here 3 months now, and you still don't know a single soul in town besides me and old Patsy at the hardware store." He said it like a joke, the way a man does when he doesn't know how to say the real thing. He said, "At this rate, you'll never get married." He meant it to be light. He meant it to land easy. But the moment it left his mouth, he felt it sitting wrong. He felt it the way you feel a wrong note in a song. Clara looked at him, not with hurt exactly, more like something shifting behind her eyes, like a door that had been cracked open was now deciding whether to open all the way or close for good. And she said in a voice so quiet he almost missed it over the wind, Only if you ask me. And then she picked up her chicken and she walked back toward the house. Dusty stood there by that spigot for a long moment. He was 54 years old, and he had spent those years being careful, being sensible, telling himself that some doors were not meant for him. He thought about Patrice in Portland. He thought about all the mornings he had driven out to this farm and told himself it was just about the fence work. He thought about blue tin coffee mugs and sunsets and a woman who held a chicken like it was nothing and talked about hard things like they were just weather that had already passed. And something moved in his chest, something old and stubborn like the land itself. He walked toward the house. Clara was standing at the kitchen counter when he came through the screen door. She had her back to him, and she was very still. The chicken was sitting on the porch outside, looking put out about something. Dusty took his hat off. He held it in both hands, the way a man holds something he is trying not to crush. He said, "Clara." She didn't turn around right away. He said, "I have been driving out here 3 times a week for 3 months, and I have been telling myself it was about the fence." He said the fence was done 6 weeks ago. He heard her breath catch just slightly. He said, "I am not a man who says things easy. I am probably going to say this wrong, but I would rather say it wrong than not say it at all." He said, "You told me this place got under your skin." He said, "It got under mine a long time ago, but you're the reason. I've been glad about it this summer." He said, "I don't know what your plans are, and I don't know what mine look like past next Tuesday most days, but know that when you said those words out there just now, I felt something shift." He said, "I'm asking Clara." He said, "If you'll let me, I'm asking." She turned around then. Her eyes were bright in the way that doesn't always mean tears, but sometimes just means something real is happening. She looked at him, standing there with his hat in his hands, and his jaw set the way it got when he was trying hard. And she said, "Dusty Hargrove, you took long enough." They didn't make any grand promises that afternoon. They were both old enough to know that grand promises made on an afternoon don't always hold the shape of a life. What they did was sit on that old log bench by the barn with 2 cups of coffee and talk until the sun started dropping behind the hills and the sky went the color of something you can't name but only feel. Clara said she was not in any hurry. She said she had learned that hurrying toward things sometimes meant running past them. Dusty said he agreed. He said he was good at taking his time. He said sometimes maybe too good. She laughed at that. A real laugh, the kind that comes from the belly and doesn't apologize for itself. He said he thought she ought to stay in Ridgeline. He said not on account of him necessarily, but because the land had already decided it wanted her, and the land out here was not wrong about these things. She looked at him sideways and said that was the most poetic thing she had ever heard a fence repairman say. He said, "Don't go spreading that around." The farm sold in October, but Clara had already put a deposit down on a small place 2 miles up the road, a little house with a proper chicken coop and a view of the same hills she had come to love over that long summer. Dusty helped her move in on a Saturday in late fall. He carried boxes and furniture and said very little, but he was there all day, and when the light started going, he built a fire in her fireplace without being asked. And they sat in front of it with sandwiches and the red hen, wandering the kitchen floor like she owned the place. Clara said it felt like home already. Dusty looked at the fire and said he was glad. He reached over and took her hand. He didn't say anything else, and he didn't need to. There are people who will tell you that love is a young person's game, that the big feelings belong to the people with smooth faces and whole lives ahead of them. But there is something that happens when you have lived long enough to know